In 1910, they shut down the schools that taught natural medicine. But your great-grandmother never stopped gathering willow bark for fever, and science proved she was right. Number 7 on this list was something every Old West child learned before age 10. Number 3 saved more lives than any gun. These 25 skills weren't banned. They were replaced by products someone could sell you. Fact 25. Before books were accessible in the Old West, an entire family's knowledge, recipes, remedies, roots, hunting techniques, warnings about the land lived in the memory of the elders. Your great-grandfather, isolated on a farm in the Great Plains, didn't write anything down. He told it. He told it around the fire after dinner, during long rides, while fixing a fence. And whoever listened memorized it. When an elder died without passing on what they knew, that knowledge died with them. In the Old West, every death was a small library burning. The arrival of cheap printing in the late 19th century and then radio in the 20th century drastically reduced the need for memorization. Studies from Columbia University in 2011 confirmed what psychologists had already suspected. Since the internet became popular, human memory for specific facts has dropped significantly. The brain outsourced storage to Google. Fact 24. For pioneer families in the Old West who lived near the Missouri Platte or Colorado rivers, fishing was an essential source of protein. Your great-grandfather wove fishing nets using specific knots with precise tension and geometric patterns. Repairing a hole in the net meant recreating the original pattern. No manual, no tutorial. Hooks were forged from wire on the same anvil used to shoe horses. Fishing lines were made from animal gut or plant fiber gathered along the riverbank. All the gear was made and repaired by the same family that used it. When companies like the Shakespeare Company and Pfluger started mass-producing fishing gear in the early 20th century, the handmade skill that had supported Old West families for generations disappeared in a single generation. Buying ready-made gear is an entirely modern concept. An Old West pioneer would have thought it was absurd to pay for something any 12-year-old kid on the frontier knew how to make. Fact 23. On the Great Plains of the Old West, Nebraska, Kansas, Dakota, where there was no wood or stone for hundreds of miles, your great-grandfather cut blocks from the grass-covered ground and stacked them like bricks. A medium-sized sod house required about 3,000 blocks. It was hard work, but incredibly efficient, warm in the brutal plains winters, cool in the scorching summer. The downside was the moisture. Long rains made the roof drip, and snakes sometimes fell from the grass roof. But for thousands of homesteader families, the sod house was the difference between having shelter and dying from exposure in the first winter. With the expansion of the railroads starting in 1870, sawn lumber began arriving on the plains. The lumber industry actively pushed the replacement. A free material from the ground was traded for a product someone could sell. By 1900, most of the Old West sod houses had already been abandoned. Today, sustainable building engineers study the thermal logic of sod houses for modern projects. Your great-grandfather in the Old West already knew that without knowing the name. Fact 22. In the Old West, your great-grandfather watched the corn and knew what was coming. Too much blooming in the spring meant a harsh winter was on the way. Weeds growing in a specific position revealed excess moisture in the soil. The color of corn leaves at a certain stage showed a nutrient deficiency. This hands-on farming knowledge, built over generations of watching the same piece of land on frontier farms, was more refined than most modern soil tests for small properties. Starting in the 1950s, companies like Monsanto and Dow Chemical began selling industrial fertilizers and pesticides as a one-size-fits-all solution. The Old West farmer who knew every inch of his soil was replaced by the farmer who followed the product label. When families left the land in the 1960s and 70s, that local farming science, developed for the specific microclimate of that frontier farm, died with them. Fact 21. In the Old West, when your great-grandfather slaughtered a cow, a pig, or a deer, absolutely nothing went to waste. The meat was salted or smoked in the property's smokehouse. The hide was cured. You'll see how in fact number 2. The fat became cooking oil, candles, and soap. The bones were boiled for broth and then ground into fertilizer. The stomach and intestines were washed for sausage casings. Frontier children helped from an early age and learned that wasting any part of the animal was morally and practically unacceptable in the Old West. City laws started banning home slaughter in the 1960s and 70s, supposedly for sanitary reasons. But inspections rarely reached industrial slaughterhouses where conditions were genuinely horrible. The laws targeted small producers who were direct competition for big meat packers like Swift and Armour. More than a dozen U.S. states still allow small-scale slaughter for personal use. Each of these skills I'm showing you here has a specific technique behind it, a step-by-step process that fit in a single book back then and still fits today. I compiled 50 of those complete techniques into a guide called the Lost Cowboy Code. If you want to truly learn how your great-grandfather did each of these things, not just know they existed, but know how to do them, the link is in the first comment. Continuing. Fact 20. Knowledge of medicinal plants, native to the Great Plains and the forests of the American East, was part of the standard toolkit for many Old West families, often learned from indigenous communities that had already mastered those plants for centuries. Your great-grandmother on the frontier used willow bark for fever and pain, echinacea for respiratory infections, mint for digestive problems, ginger root for nausea, sunflower seeds for headaches. In 1899, aspirin was patented by Bayer, using salicylic acid as the active ingredient. The same compound indigenous peoples had already been extracting from willow bark for centuries. The pharmaceutical industry grew by turning free botanical knowledge into trademarked pills. The Flexner Report of 1910 shut down medical schools that taught herbal medicine. The message was clear: buy the medicine, don't grow it. Modern science has validated many of these plants. Your great-grandmother in the Old West, with no degree at all, was right the whole time. Fact 19. In the Old West, before rulers or tape measures were in anyone's pocket, your great-grandfather was already solving measurement problems every day. He would look at a mountain on the Great Plains horizon and estimate the distance by the clarity of the air and the apparent size of the peaks. He would walk the perimeter of a field he planned to plant, counting his own steps. He would look at a standing tree and figure out how much lumber it would yield before wasting energy cutting it down. It wasn't exact science. It was practical math, good enough to make real decisions on the frontier. With the arrival of cheap measuring tools in the late 19th century, this spatial skill that every Old West man had stopped being taught. What was lost wasn't precision. It was the ability to function without any tool at all. Your great-grandfather's brain was the only measuring instrument available in the Old West. And it worked. Fact 18. In the Old West, before any kind of mass-produced container, every family on the American frontier had to make their own baskets. And the ones who mastered that skill better than anyone were indigenous women. They wove baskets from reeds and willow so tightly that some could carry liquids without leaking. Think about that. No plastic, no cheap metal, none of that. Just plant fibers woven with such precision that they worked almost like a bucket. These baskets were used for everything in daily life in the Old West, storing grain through the winter, carrying crops from the field to the house, sifting flour. When metal containers and later plastic ones became cheap around the turn of the 20th century, basket making stopped being a necessity and became decorative craftwork. A product that cost pennies replaced centuries of technical knowledge. The first 8 skills on this list were taught to every Old West child before age 12, not as an option, as survival. Each one of them was free, didn't cost a penny, and each one was replaced by a product someone could sell you. That's not a coincidence, that's business. Fact 17. Tooth pain was one of the most common and most dangerous problems in the Old West. It sounds like an exaggeration, but it wasn't. With no dentist within several days' ride by horse, your great-grandfather on the frontier came up with his own remedies. Pressed cloves in the cavity gave temporary relief. Whiskey on the gums numbed the area, and when nothing worked, someone in the family grabbed a pair of pliers and pulled the tooth right there. No anesthesia, no hygiene, nothing. The real problem started when nobody pulled the rotten tooth in time. The infection spread through the jaw, entered the bloodstream, and turned into sepsis. Historical studies estimate that a significant portion of deaths recorded as fever during the pioneer period were actually dental infections that got out of control. Something as simple as a cavity could be a death sentence on the American frontier. Fact 16. More people died crossing rivers in the Old West than in famous shootouts, and most of them didn't even know how to swim. Rivers like the Missouri, the Platte, and the Snake were both road and trap at the same time. When your great-grandfather reached the bank, he had to decide fast. Build a raft out of logs tied together with rawhide, or try to cross on foot. The problem was that a calm river in October turned into a killing machine in the spring, when snow from the Rocky Mountains melted. The current changed from one day to the next. Horses, even though they were good swimmers, would panic in the middle of the crossing and drown the rider along with them. The protocol of the most experienced pioneers: check where the water hit the knee, tie everything important above the waist, and never cross facing straight into the current, always at an angle. Whoever ignored those rules on the rivers of the Old West usually didn't get a second chance. Fact 15. In the Old West, fire wasn't comfort, it was survival. No fire, no hot food, no clean water, no protection from wolves and coyotes at night. Your great-grandfather used flint and tinder, flint and steel, and could start a fire in under 2 minutes in any condition on the frontier: wind, cold, rain. The secret was in the preparation: dry fungus, fine grass, processed bark. Getting the angle of the stone wrong meant being cold and hungry that night. But starting it was only the beginning. Keeping the cooking fire going in an Old West camp required attention for up to 16 straight hours. Each type of wood had a purpose: oak for long-lasting coals, pine for emergencies, hickory for the right smoke that preserved meat for weeks. Starting in the 1880s, when gas stoves began showing up in eastern cities, knowledge of fire management, the most important technology a frontier man mastered, became a historical curiosity in less than 2 generations. Fact 14. Before any factory, every Old West family made their own clothes, literally from scratch. They sheared the sheep, cleaned the wool, carded it, spun it on a spinning wheel, and then knitted or wove everything by hand. A wool undershirt could take weeks to finish. Pioneer women spun while talking with neighbors and knitted when the children were asleep. The looms were so big, they took up entire corners of the frontier home. Every mother taught her daughter, because without that skill, the family would freeze in the merciless winter of the plains. Starting in 1790, textile mills like Samuel Slater's in Rhode Island began producing fabric cheaper than any Old West family could make at home. By 1830, The American textile industry already employed more than 70,000 workers. A centuries-old tradition, passed from mother to daughter as an essential survival skill on the frontier, became obsolete in a single generation. Fact 13. In the Old West, thirst killed faster than bullets, and the people who survived in the dry territories of the Southwest and the Great Plains had one trick. They knew how to read the land. Greener vegetation in a dry valley pointed to underground water. Granite and limestone with specific cracks gave away where water came to the surface. Birds and insects flew toward water in the morning and at dusk, always. And when none of that was nearby, the Southwest barrel cactus had enough liquid to keep a man alive for one more day. None of these tricks were written in any book. They were passed down from father to son, from guide to settler, through conversation and experience in the camps and on the trails of the Old West. It was the kind of knowledge you didn't learn in school. You learned it lost in the desert, with your throat dry and the sun beating down. Notice the pattern. Every skill on this list existed because the Old West pioneer couldn't depend on anyone but himself. 200 miles from the nearest town, there was no plan B. Every skill was replaced by a paid service or product. Fact 12. Look at a dry stone wall and you won't find a single nail. No wire, no cement, just stone on stone. The settlers who came to the American East and then spread into the Old West brought this technique from Ireland and England, where the craft had already existed for centuries. The rule took a trained eye, each stone resting on two below it, no vertical joint lined up with the one underneath. Get the fit wrong, and the whole thing collapses. Get it right, and the wall lasts 200, 300 years without anyone touching it. Some walls in New England have been standing since the 1600s and are still solid. There was no manual in the Old West. A man learned by doing, messing up, and doing it again. Pure geometry by trial and error. When barbed wire was patented by Joseph Glidden in '84 and spread across the frontier, the dry stone wall lost its reason to exist. An industrial product replaced centuries of craft. Fact 11. It's estimated that almost half the population of the Old West never set foot in a school. But that didn't stop anyone from learning. The Bible was the only book in most frontier homes, and it was what they used to learn how to put letters together. The mother taught the alphabet at the kitchen table by lamplight. Whoever knew how to read a little taught whoever knew nothing. When someone in the Old West wrote a letter to a distant relative, it took hours, sometimes days, and whoever received it read that letter so many times they memorized every word. There was no Google, no library on the corner. There was the will to learn, and one single book. And with that, entire generations of pioneers learned to read and write in the middle of nowhere, on the plains of Kansas, in the valleys of Wyoming, on the isolated farms of Montana. Fact 10. A horse without a horseshoe in the Old West could go lame in just a few days. And losing your horse on the frontier was almost a death sentence. No horse, no transportation, no work, no escape. Farriers made good money because of that. But your great-grandfather, isolated on a remote Old West farm, didn't have that option. He taught himself, removing a broken shoe, filing the hoof, nailing on a new one temporarily. The horse's hoof has a structure similar to a human fingernail, only much thicker. A nail at the wrong angle could pierce the living tissue and leave the animal limping for the rest of its life. There was no veterinarian around the corner on the frontier to fix the damage. The skill disappeared along with everyday workhorses. Today it survives among certified professionals who care for sport horses. Fact 9. Before radar and satellites, the Old West farmer looked at the sky and knew what was coming. It wasn't a guess. High, thin cirrus clouds meant rain within 24 to 48 hours. A ring around the moon was a warning that a storm was moving in across the plains. Wind from the west brought good weather in most parts of the Midwest, and the animals gave it away before any forecast. Cattle gathered in one corner of the pasture, birds flew low, ants sealed the entrances to their nests. Generations of Old West pioneers passed this knowledge down, and it worked because it was real science, tested in the field, day after day, year after year. Modern meteorological studies have confirmed most of these signs as statistically reliable. The frontier farmer who ignored these signs paid a heavy price. He could lose the crop, lose the cattle. Sometimes he lost his own life. Your great-grandfather in the Old West didn't have a weather app. He had something better. Decades of observation built up on the same piece of land. Fact 8. If you got badly cut in the Old West, there was no emergency room. The nearest doctor could be days away by horseback across the frontier. So who handled it? The women of the house. Your great-grandmother learned to stitch deep cuts with a needle and thread sterilized in alcohol or fire. She learned to recognize infection, drain an abscess, set a broken bone, all in the farmhouse kitchen with whatever was available. In 1830, the book Gunn's Domestic Medicine became almost a Bible for Old West pioneer families, a complete medical guide for people who had no access to a doctor. Thousands of families on the frontier survived because of that book. What stands out is that for most of human history, people took care of their own health. This idea of depending completely on a medical professional for everything is less than 150 years old. Here's what nobody tells you. Every skill on this list was science. No degree, no lab, no funding, just an Old West pioneer, observation, repetition, and consequences. Fact 7. The 3 basic preservation techniques of the Old West, salting, smoking, and sun-drying, were mastered by every pioneer family. Salted meat lasted for months in the barrel. Meat smoked with hickory or mesquite lasted for weeks in the smokehouse. Jerky, strips of meat dried in the open sun, lasted for months and was portable, perfect for long rides across the frontier. Fruit went into sugar preserves, vegetables fermented in salt. Old West children learned early exactly how much salt to rub in, how long to smoke, how far from the fire. This wasn't something you learned from a cookbook. It was passed down the same way people learned to ride and shoot in the Old West. Getting winter provisions wrong meant the death of the family. The processed food industry, led by companies like Swift and Armour, starting in the 1880s, turned preservation into an industrial product. Homemade frontier knowledge became unnecessary. Fact 6. Imagine your axe breaking 200 miles from the nearest blacksmith in the Old West. No store, no replacement part, nothing. That was everyday life on the frontier. Your great-grandfather would look around, find a branch with the right kind of wood, and carve a new handle right there at camp. Chain snapped, wire fixed it. If there was spare metal, he forged nails in a campfire. Every Old West pioneer was part blacksmith, part carpenter, part inventor. Not because of talent, out of pure necessity. The repair only had to last until the next town, and it usually lasted much longer. It was a different mindset. You didn't throw things away, you figured it out. Starting with the industrialization of the late 19th century, the logic of disposable began replacing the logic of repair that every Old West man had mastered. Your great-grandfather on the frontier would be ashamed to see how much good stuff gets thrown away every day. Fact 5. Do you know what happens when you mix fireplace ash with pig lard? and boil it all for an entire day? Soap. That's how soap was made in the Old West. There wasn't a store within 300 miles of the frontier farm. Your great-grandmother gathered ashes from burned wood, poured water over them, and extracted a substance called lye. Then she mixed it with whatever animal fat was available and cooked it for hours on end. If she got the ratio wrong, the soap came out too strong and burned the skin, too weak, and it didn't clean anything. Getting it right took years of practice under the improvised conditions of the Old West. Most frontier families set aside 1 or 2 days a year just for this and made enough soap for 12 months. Procter & Gamble launched Ivory Soap in 1879 and spent the equivalent of millions convincing Americans that homemade soap was primitive and unhygienic. It worked. By 1920, almost nobody made soap at home anymore. Fact 4. A pioneer lost in the Old West with nothing in his pockets didn't sit down and cry. He looked around and got to work. In less than an hour, using branches, dry leaves, and dirt, he built what they called a debris hut, a wooden cocoon covered with foliage. It sounds primitive, but the logic makes modern engineers respect it. The inside space was so tight that his own body heat warmed the whole thing. Modern tests have shown that this structure keeps the inside temperature up to 15 degrees Celsius, warmer than outside. 10-year-old children in Old West pioneer families learned this as routine. It was as basic as knowing how to start a fire on the frontier. Homemade soap became ivory. Home-tanned leather became industry. Hand-spun wool became textile mills. Navigating by the sky became GPS. Plant medicine became patented pills. Stone fences became barbed wire. None of the replacements worked better. They all worked more profitably. That's not a conspiracy. That's business. Fact 3. Bison hunters crossed the Great Plains of the Old West for weeks without any map. No compass, no trail markers. Just the enormous frontier sky. The North Star gave true north. At noon, the position of the sun revealed south. And there was a trick few people know. They stuck a stick in the ground and watched the shadow move from west to east, which let them figure out the time with good accuracy. These Old West men read the land, the wind, and the daylight, the same way we read ways today. Mountain men like Jim Bridger became famous for mentally mapping territories the size of entire states, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, without writing down a single line. It was a skill as natural as breathing in the Old West. When navigation tools became popular in the late 19th century, nobody needed to look up anymore. And that wisdom disappeared in a single generation. Your great-grandfather in the Old West knew exactly where he was by looking at the sky. You lose your way when the GPS freezes. Fact 2. Few people know this, but in the Old West, the animal's own brain was the main ingredient for tanning its hide. Pioneers discovered that every mammal produces enough brain fat to treat its own hide, a coincidence that sounds made up. The process took days. They removed the hair, rubbed the brain into the rawhide, stretched it on wooden frames, and repeated everything until it became flexible. One mistake at any step, and the leather would rot within weeks. Done right, it lasted 30 years. Old West women usually did this work, turning the material into moccasins, belts, bags, and saddle straps. Much of the knowledge came from indigenous peoples who had already mastered the technique for centuries. When tanning factories like the U.S. Leather Company spread across the country starting in 1870, nobody needed to learn anymore. What disappeared along with the need was the knowledge of creating something durable with only your hands and what the land provided. Fact 1. This is number 1. Because it sums up everything this list represents. The ability to read the world without any technology at all. In the Old West, your great-grandfather would kneel in the dirt and know how many animals had passed through, how long ago, which direction they were going, and whether they were scared or calm. The depth of the track revealed the weight. The distance between steps revealed the speed. The angle of the claws gave the exact direction. Cowboys used this skill every day to find lost cattle, track prey, detect whether a mountain lion was prowling around the camp. The knowledge came from indigenous peoples who mastered reading the land like no one else. Old West trackers like Kit Carson and Tom Horn became legendary for this skill. Today, the only ones who still know how to do it are some Special Forces veterans and members of tribes who kept the tradition alive. A skill that once saved thousands of lives on the frontier and that the modern world simply forgot. And that's the whole point of this list. Every item was knowledge that kept people alive in the Old West. It wasn't a hobby. It wasn't nostalgia. It was the difference between existing and not existing in the most unforgiving territory in America.